Alright guys, I'm Amir and today we're going to cover Alan Brinkley's AP United's History textbook, Chapter 4, The Empire in Transition, which covers the French and Indian War and the events that lead up to the American Revolution. So by the end of the chapter you can know the steps and the causes that led to the American Revolution. Alright, the tradition of neglect. So what's important to know at this period is that the Parliament is a supreme force in the British government. Parliament during the 18th century developed power over George I and George II. Robert Walpole, who was the first Prime Minister, purposefully neglected the Navigation Acts in an effort to promote colonial commerce. You remember the Navigation Acts that came before that were designed based on mercantilism ideals to help create revenues from the colonies for the British Empire. Parliament at the time enabled colonial decentralization. Nobody really cared about the colonies. There was no colonial office in London. The closest thing was the Board of Trade and Plantations, which was created in 1696. Nobody concentrated on the colonies alone. People concentrated at London on the empire as a whole. The colonies were viewed as just another bit of the empire, nothing too special. The colonies at the time, it's important to note, were also divided. It's not like they were all united, had one culture, and were later on defined against the British. No, the colonies actually felt closer ties to the English rather than their neighboring colonies because they could identify more with the British culture. Another important event that took place that shows the colonies were divided was the introduction of the Albany Plan in 1754. It was before the 7 Years' War, which we'll cover later, was about to break out. And Benjamin Franklin introduced this plan that would unite basically all the colonies under one central government. However, the colonies rejected this idea. They were more in favor of having local governments, local officials, local laws, and this really showed the divided nature of the colonies. And it's important to know that how suddenly, with the policy that the British introduced in this period leading up to the American Revolution, how the colonies become united against the British. Part of the American continent was mainly dominated by two forces at the time, the British and the French. And we're going to give you a little background on the events that kind of lead up to the French and Indian War, because there was a lot of tension at the time on the American continent between the English and the French. But in the 1750s, there was a big tension between the French and English in religious and commercial ties. The French wanted to expand their presence in present-day United States under Louis XIV. French fur traders drew further and further into the continent, and you can see how land disputes might come up after that. Religiously, the French were heavily Catholic. Missionaries were going throughout the continent in order to spread their ideals. The French were also expanding land-wise into the American continent before and during this time. René Robert in 1682 claimed Louisiana. Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette went to Lake Michigan, to Arkansas, and the Mississippi rivers in the 1670s by canoe. And Pierre Gautier went all the way to the Rocky Mountains in 1743. And it's not as if the French were establishing a big presence in these lands. They were just exploring and interacting with the Native American tribes. But what's important to know that in these middle grounds, where the Indians and the French lived along each other, the French were able to develop a really good relationship with the Indians. Because the French were not like the British, who wanted the Indians to change, who wanted the Indians to follow English law. The French were much more tolerant. They allowed the Indians to keep their culture, and thus they were able to establish a very positive and very good relationship with the Indians. An important Indian power at the time was the Iroquois Confederacy. that was created among Indian tribes such as the Mohawks, the Seneca, the Cayuga, Onondaga, and other Indian tribes. It was the most powerful. They were the most powerful tribes in these middle grounds, and they formed an important trade relationship with the English and the Dutch as well as the French. Now, some early struggles. The French claimed the Ohio Valley. However, the English were also expanding into this land at the time. Also, there were many Indian tribes who were living in these lands at the time. So you can see how these tensions are gonna lead to some armed conflict. Now we're gonna cover some previous Anglo-French conflicts. The first one is King William's War, which is not really that important. It occurred between 1689 and 1697. There was some indecisive clashes between the French and the English. Now, the second one is really important. Queen Anne's War, or the War of Spanish Succession. That occurred between 1701 and 1713. Now, what's important about it is the outcome of it. By the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, the French transferred substantial territory, including Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, to Britain. Another important war was King George's War in 1744 to 1748, which was the first major English defeat. New Englanders captured Cape Breton Island and made a peace treaty. The treaty ended the conflict, and the English were forced to abandon the island. After this, the English were bitter about their loss, and obviously there was a lot of tension between the French and English as a result. Another important French and English clash was with George Washington at Fort Necessity. After escalating tensions, Virginia governor sent militia under young Colonel George Washington into the Ohio Valley to challenge the French. Remember how both the French, the English, and the Indians were merging into the Ohio Valley, and how we said that there was obviously going to be some form of conflict there as a result? Here it is. Fort Necessity was near Fort Duquesne, the French fort. The French assaulted Fort Necessity and trapped the English inside. A third of the militia of George Washington died, and Washington surrendered. This marked the beginning of the Anglo-French struggle for the empire, the French and Indian War. This was, the French and Indian War is also referred to as the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1773. But in the Americas, the conflict started 2 years earlier, so it was more like 9 years. And this was the first major conflict in the larger scheme of things. Alright. So the French and Indian War, we can divide it up basically into 3 phases. The first phase was from 1754 to 1756, when the French and English engaged in the Americas. However, the British government provided almost no assistance to the war effort in the Americas, as they concentrated on their continental struggles. Remember, there was also a war going on in Europe, the 7 Years' War. And the British did not have the time nor the means to assist the Americans. The British really did not even stop the influx of French boats that were going to Canada. At the time, local colonies were more concerned with defending their own colonies from Indian attacks, so there was still no unified colonial resistance. All the Indians, aside the Iroquois, allied themselves with the French. The Iroquois were fearful of antagonizing the French and engaged in only a few hostilities. After the first phase of the struggle, the Americans in 1755 retreated, and thus came in the second phase, where William Pitt, the Secretary of State and later Prime Minister, transformed the war effort in the Americas by engaging in more of a direct role, and brought the war effort under the British command. And the Americans were not happy about this. One of the policies that Pitt imposed was Impressment, which was basically a draft of American colonials, where British commanders started forcibly enlisting colonists. The British commanders, took for the colonies and took colonists' tools without compensation. They took supplies, food, without any compensation. And the colonists understandably, were not happy about this. And this led to colonial discontent. So much discontent that in 1757 there was a riot of colonists in New York City. And this phase, which started from 1756 to 1758, where the British took more of a direct control of the war effort, led almost to a halt of the war effort, because the colonists were so pissed off at the British because they were encroaching on their business. And it comes in the third phase, when Parliament and the British government relaxed control of the colonists. They promised to compensate the colonists for their lost supplies, and they returned the military recruitment control to the colonial assemblies. And this led to a dramatic enlistment of British forces by the colonists. Now, during this third phase, which starts in 1758 and ends ultimately with the end of the conflict in 1763, the war starts to turn in the British favor. For many reasons. First of which was that in 1756 the French colonists experienced a poor harvest and allowed the British to quickly attack the vulnerable force of French people in 1758. In July of 1758, James Wolfe captured a fortress in Luxembourg. A few months later, they captured Fort Tuscany. And in 1759, the most pivotal moment in the war occurred, when General Wolfe surprised the French army under the command of Marquis de Montcalm in Quebec, a stronghold for the French armies at the time. Both commanders died at the time in a battle that became later known as the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. But the French surrendered, and this was a key American victory. And the French surrendered in Montreal in September 1760. The Peace of Paris, which ultimately officially ended the conflict, came 3 years later, in 1763. At the time, George III also ascended the throne and wanted the hostilities to stop, unlike William Pitt, who wanted the hostilities to continue. By the Peace of Paris, the French transferred many of the West Indies islands, most of their colonies in India, Canada, and all east of the Mississippi colonies to the English. They ceded New Orleans and the West Mississippi colonies to Spain, and basically lost all of their American possessions.